is Christy Hovanes from the Foundation for Excellence in Education.
Anyone else? All right, here is our agenda. Well, we always start anything at the department with the vision and mission of the Department of Education to create a world-class education system that gives students knowledge and skills to be successful in college and the workforce. The strategic plan goals of the department, and as we've talked about, the work of this task force touches just about all of those different goals. Our goals for the task force this year have been really threefold: to determine the types and quality and amount of tests that students take on the state and district level, to provide recommendations, which is what we'll be doing today, on ways to ensure student testing is streamlined but measures the learning goals, and to discover and recommend best practices for student testing on the state and district level. There's our expectations. Meetings are live streamed, and we might have media present, so if you're speaking, if you're live here, make sure that you speak into a microphone there. Today's agenda. We're going to have two presentations first. First of all, we're going to have John Craman, who is the MDE Chief Information Officer. He's going to be talking to us about some technology issues that came up loud and clear through both the district survey and through the teacher survey. That there was frustration shared from teachers and administrators on technology issues, and he's going to give us some best practices and some things that might help districts in that. And then following his presentation, Dr. Chris Domaleski with the National Center for the Improvement of Educational Assessment will lead a presentation and discussion around state testing on a national level and what it looks like outside of Mississippi, and some recommendations and things to guide our discussion. Then after that, we're going to break out into some study groups to give some recommendations, but because of the size of the group that is here, we'll do that as a whole group, and we have 4 individuals that will help lead that discussion. Hampton from Lamar County will lead our discussion on benchmark and interim testing. Ms. Kelly Riley will lead our discussion on teacher concerns and frustrations that they did. Dr. Benita Potter will talk about state testing and any recommendations we have there. And Dr. Robert Sanders will end the meeting today with discussion around technology concerns. And so hopefully we can come up with some pertinent recommendations that can be given to the department for them to go forward and act on. And then at the end, the conclusion of the meeting, we'll decide whether we need to meet one more time or if we have our work done in earnest at the time of this. So at this time, Mr. Craven, we'll recognize you and go ahead with your presentation.
Thank you very much. Obviously, that as was just mentioned, the last task force meeting, you all heard about a number of concerns around technology and how it intersects with the work of this task force. Dr. Wright asked me to provide an overview of the technology world that connects these online experiences from testing with the local and then the internet infrastructure that supports the transmission of that content. As was mentioned, the mission and vision for the agency does directly touch on this, especially as schools begin to rely more and more on online content and services. The infrastructure, the internet, becomes more pertinent to these discussions, and as districts look into the future, it's important to think about not only where they are, but where they need to be, and then be planning accordingly. None of this spins up very quickly. And so long-term planning is essential to stay current and on top and ahead of these growing demand. The Office of Technology and Strategic Services is obviously heavily invested in Goal 5, but as was already mentioned, this online content, this online services really does play throughout in this discussion generally. The testing task force addresses a lot of these various goals in the strategic plan. So looking across the surveys that were reported out last task force meeting, I wanted to break things down in a couple different ways, and I hope you'll just kind of bear with me and interrupt me if you have any questions at all. But I want to keep this very, very high level. We can dig deeper if you all want to dig deeper. Heavy internet traffic, right? There is a lot of content that's moving between schools and districts and the internet in a number of areas. Obviously, we're talking today about online content and services being delivered to the classroom, affecting instruction, professional development, testing, and so forth. But also the operations of school districts are also becoming heavily reliant on online connections. Whether you're talking about uploading files to MSIS as part of the monthly reporting, or whether you're talking about downloading content or updates to your software that you're using in your environment. There's a lot of content and traffic that's moving across the internet connection. In addition, districts and schools have children bringing devices or are buying devices for children to use. All of these are just increasing the demand on your network. So there are common concerns, and if we think about this as traffic, these pictures are really meant to kind of help with this. If you're talking about at peak usage, lots of lanes of traffic moving into a concentrated point or converging, you have what is called oversubscription, and the picture in the upper right shows different lanes of traffic merging together that suddenly create a backlog. Another kind is the bottleneck, where you may have, in this bottom left picture, you have cars that are moving in 3 lanes but are being compressed down to 1 lane for the purpose of, in this case, a construction issue. So you may have 3 lanes on the front and 3 lanes on the back, but your fastest point, or your fastest speed really is your slowest point. So if you've got 1 lane moving forward, then that's as fast as you're going to go. If you've got lots of cars moving against that off of 3 lanes, then you're going to get a slowdown. The third category is when you have stuff that doesn't really belong in your network coming in. And this sort of junk information that can really be sent from the outside can overwhelm a network pretty quickly if you're not prepared for it and not able to respond to it effectively. So these are the 3 buckets. You either have too much stuff going through, you've got artificial constraints placed on your network, or you've got unwanted content moving through your network. So what does this look like, and how do these pain points really emerge inside of a district or school? So I want to walk you through kind of where the internet comes in and how then that speed or bandwidth or connection is then conveyed down to the classroom, to the student. So the first step really is that you're connected to online content and services through the internet. That internet connection is connected typically to the central office of the district. There's a district network or wide area network called a WAN. Then within schools, you have what is called a local area network or LAN. And then, of course, you have the devices themselves that students or others are using to connect and to leverage that available speed. So the first step, and I'll walk through each of these steps. The amount of speed or bandwidth that you're purchasing or district is purchasing from an internet service provider needs to meet or exceed what the usage is on the inside of the building. If you have twice as much usage than you have bandwidth, there's going to be a slowdown or an oversubscription experience inside the district or schools. The MD currently monitors internet usage of 87 districts through the state consortium. And right now, what we see is not a problem with the internet speed, meaning that we are not seeing an overuse or maxed out use of the internet speed going into the building, which means that the problems are typically then located inside of the district's network. Internet speed, if you need to buy more, it's reimbursable through E-rate, which means that the federal government will provide a reimbursement between 80 and 90% to districts based on the socioeconomics of the district or the population of your district. And so if you need more, you can buy more. And you can, much of that can be reimbursed through the federal reimbursement rate. The second piece is what happens at the district office, the central office. Lots of different pieces of equipment are necessary to convey that internet signal into your district. Different kinds of firewalls, filters, routers, switches, and so forth. Each of these has to be calibrated to the speed you need. If it's like a toll booth on your interstate, you could have easy pass and just breeze through at speed, or everyone's going to get off the interstate, slow down, and go through a booth and come to a stop or near stop to pay that toll. So having your equipment calibrated to the right level, configured to the right level, set to the right level. And again, your slowest point in this equipment exchange of information or of the signal will determine how fast your system is. Most of these pieces of equipment are and their initial setup is available for reimbursement through E-rate. This is called Category 2. For whatever reason, web content filters, which obviously you want to keep inappropriate material out of your schools, that's not eligible. And oftentimes, if you see people getting fully reimbursed for much of the equipment, but then kind of on their own buying additional equipment, but not having enough resources, you cut down on your web filter in terms of its ability to process and handle the traffic, you're going to slow your system down. The next piece then is, how does that internet signal, once it's worked its way through your central office and all of your equipment and all your configurations, how are you dispersing that signal to your buildings? If you have 4 lanes of traffic, meaning you have 4 buildings, and those traffic are going back and forth between your district office and your schools, but you only have 1 lane going in and out for the internet, right, you're going to have a problem. And adding more speed in your network is not going to solve the problem. It's going to confound it, or compound it, or both. And again, this is Category 1 within your local network is reimbursable. And you really want to think about the balance. What do you have on the left-hand side versus the right-hand side? Do you have enough speed inside of your district, as well as is that speed then paralleled to the speed you have coming into the district? Once you get into the school, obviously you're going to set up access points, whether they're wired into the wall or there's a Wi-Fi access point up on the ceiling or somewhere in your building. You have to start thinking about where these things are. So location, location, location. It matters where these are. Also, interestingly, it matters whether or not you have different materials using to build your building that may interfere with that signal, or whether you have your teachers in the lounge, teacher lounge, heating up a burrito in a microwave oven that's close to an access point or close to where kids are testing. All of these things can matter. And so obviously when you get these things set up and put into place, it's important to ask these critical questions. Where are your hot spots? Where are your cold spots? Are kids moving around in the building with these points? And how are they connecting in? So this is the next point where, again, if you have enough signal coming in, but you don't have enough of it dispersed within your building, or there are other things interfering with the building, you're going to have problems. And then the last stop are the devices themselves. What kinds of devices do you have? How many do you have? Are you bringing Apple and PC? Are you bringing in different operating systems? How are all these different systems with all these different levels of power, speed themselves on the devices, the types of systems and software they have, are they actually compatible with your network? Are they able to log in, the students that is, through these devices? But also, are they moving around? Are there updates that need to be downloaded to the device? You can imagine that a student tries to log in, but nobody's ever bothered to log the student in, and they're trying to take a test. What happens? Or let's say they log in, and then suddenly it says, nope, you got to download the following 6 patches. And every computer in your system just turned on, and they all need to download those patches. That's a big, pretty high volume of traffic. That's going to start to slow you down. Or let's say you get on, and there are no software patches, but the requirements for the platform you're connecting to aren't met by the device. And suddenly it says you can't, this isn't effective enough, powerful enough, aligned enough to use the tool. And then who's managing all this, right? How do you have all this stuff handled, documented, kept current, and all the rest? And just turning on dusty devices once a year and hoping it all goes well is usually a good recipe for having delays and other things to deal with. So what kind of help is there? Obviously, this is a district responsibility, but that doesn't mean the districts are alone as they do this or deal with these issues. So on the one hand, you have the vendors, right? The districts are procuring services. The internet service providers are providing internet connections. You're buying equipment. A lot of this is reimbursed through E-rate, and having this sort of help and setup can really be effective done at the front end. But you can also look for other ways of having the vendors bake into their proposals these additional services for assessing the strength of your network, of testing to see what speeds you have, recommending moving some points of access around, or increasing the speed, or replacing that old switch that is taking your 1 gig connection and reducing it down to 10 megs. Get too technical about it. But again, you want to think about the vendors as one point to get additional help. And imagine that vendors that are in Mississippi, capable of providing these services, are going to have an advantage over somebody who's going to put it in a cardboard box and have it land on the front door of your district. But be thoughtful about that on the front end of the procurement. The second piece is, where can we help? Right now, the Office of Technology and Strategic Services can provide some assistance. We've done some assessments. We've done some corrections in specific districts. We also have engineers on contract who can provide additional services. As we find more demand, we can adjust to see what budget is able to provide other help. But right now, we are not terribly overtaxed with the districts requesting assistance from us, and there's more help that we could provide. In addition, there are also nonprofits and other sort of self-assessment tools that you can get at the district level and have as part of your process. So E-Rate Central is an example that can help you leverage E-Rate dollars and help you find resources and planning ahead. Future Ready is a great tool where you can basically say, look, this is where I am, this is where I want to get to. How do I start to build over the next 3 to 5 years to build the infrastructure that I do need? Because the reality is that the changes are always coming, right? The content gets richer, applications become more demanding, computers need to be updated. And there's lots of things to think about, but the more you can be thinking ahead and really aligning what you need with what you've put in place and make sure that every step along the way those signals are being preserved and maintained means that the speed will be available to you. And anywhere along the way you can see breakdowns in this. And that's where I think oftentimes if a district is running into trouble, is it the internet is a problem? Is it the broadband? Do we need more broadband? Or really, do we have the capacity to look internally and evaluate each step along the way and where are we losing our speed or our broadband access as we go? So that's the quick overview. Happy to answer any questions, and I have both some of my network guys and E-Rate coordinator here available to help answer any questions that you all may have. Sure.
One of the things that appears to be a frustration for some districts really goes back to being able to test in the environment. And I understand that some of that may be because of a couple of different reasons, from broadband all the way to they didn't update their router and just doing the work on the front side. Is there any plan, when you talked about assessments, is there any plan maybe to put us on, all of us on a rotation, so that every so often you all are actually looking, or at least for the districts who need help, because there's some of us that don't need as much help as others. But a lot of times what I'm seeing on Facebook and other places when people talk about testing frustration is really not a testing frustration, but a school frustration. And so I just think in terms of being preventive, is there a way to think about changing the structure so that you all can be more proactive as maybe waiting for district to crash and then?
Sure, right. Nothing's worse than right. Notre Dame burned down. If they'd only caught that fire before it burned the whole building down, you'd be better off. So actually, Dr. Wright and I have had conversations about moving beyond. There was a survey that was done 2 years ago about kind of where all the schools districts are. But Dr. Wright really has asked us at this very point you're raising, which is how do we help get to the front end of this and really help think through some of these issues. So we actually are developing a bit of a plan to try and figure out how to best leverage the resources we have and see whether we need additional help. But to your point is to go through, and I like your idea of going to where maybe the need is highest and start there and start working our way through. And I know that Lee Bray is here, and he's been working with districts, especially in the consortium, to help get a lot of that E-rate reimbursement done. So we can help both on the assessment side and on the E-rate reimbursement side. At the end of the day, though, it's still obviously district responsibility, and we need doors open to us and willing to work with us. But of course, we're here to help, and Dr. Wright is charged us with finding a way to become more effective on the front end of this and identify problems before they burn the cathedral down.
I know we used to have some platforms that would allow us to cache test, so that helped because my technology people would go in and actually download cache before
Right.
the environment actually started. CoStar doesn't always allow us to have the ability to do that. That hadn't been a problem for us, but I don't know if going forward as we look at testing contracts, if adding that as an opportunity would also help districts, especially those with limited capacity.
I feel like you're reading my mind. Actually, Dr. Vanderford and I have had the
feel like
same conversation. We're connecting here. But yeah, Dr. Vanderford and I have talked about sort of the notion of using the caching opportunity as a way of moving content in a measured way versus kind of all at once, and preserving both the drawing content down as well as pushing content back out in terms of performance. So we actually were on that very point. So I feel like we've been in a meeting before this to prepare these questions. So I appreciate you asking these great questions. These are great questions.
I know that there's a wide range of capabilities in districts. 10 years ago, our technology department consisted of 2 people. Now our technology department is about 20 plus people. That's including our instructional techs and everything. Since we've gone to 1-to-1, it's just mushroomed. And so, I think a lot of people. I always think of it. You're using the traffic flow. People think about the cars instead of the road the cars going to travel on. They buy the cars, but it's traveling on a broken down road bed, and the bridges are not there. well, then the car, I don't care what kind of car you buy, it's not going to be good enough. And so, the infrastructure's got to be there, and
Right.
that's got to be maintained. It can't just, that's not a one-time purchase either. That's recurring. It's got to continually, be updated and done. The great inequity comes in, though. We've got districts that started testing, this past week, and they'll be testing constantly from this past week all the way till the testing window closes. And then there are districts, like mine with 1-to-1 that we can wait until, the first 2 weeks of May. Well, we get 3 extra weeks, 4 weeks of instructional time with students. That's where this technology issue, I think that's where the frustration comes in, is there's a real inequity between the haves and the have-nots, and how can we help level the playing field for all of our districts that are not where some of us are.
Yeah.
I have a 4-6 building that has 1,600 kids in it. So while I have technology in place, we'll still probably use most of the window because of the size of the building.
Sure. Again, these are just balancing on both sides. One other thing that you just mentioned that made me think of this too is just to reiterate. If you drive up and down I-55 through Jackson or I-20 through Jackson, 22 hours out of the day, there's never going to be a problem. But if you talk about 8 in the morning or 6 o'clock, 5 o'clock at night, right, it gets jammed up. So it's the testing window is really where there's a lot of pressure on these networks. Most of the time, it's never an issue. And so if your health of the network really matters about also to whether you could scale up or scale down at the time when you need it, whether it's the devices are available 1-to-1 or whether you're talking about your internet access point. But if all the pieces of equipment aren't aligned with that scaling, you can have the vendor scale up your ISP speed, your broadband, but then nothing in the building is capable of growing or extending with that. So I think there's lots of things to be thinking about, but
That is the piece that makes it run smooth.
I have a question about the 87 districts in the state consortium. Is that voluntary, or how are
yes.
they?
Yes. So it's basically you can buy in and get, was it 250 pipe into your building from the consortium? Then you can scale it up from there. Yeah. So so you can get the service from the state. It's not getting a 1 gig pipe in your building, but we can scale it up from a baseline of 250.
That's simply service. There's no assessment like Dr. Coleman was discussing
Right. But
on
that
an ongoing basis to support.
separate from that is our
development.
ability to provide that support for that assessment. So we can help with that whether you're in the consortium or not. Oh yeah, I mean you can buy the service from a private vendor, or you can just simply take the state service through the state consortium.
Is there a good cross section of our districts that take advantage of that, or does it tend to be
Smaller, rural, it tends to be more common than larger and urban. Is that fair? Yeah. I don't think it's a universal rule, but it's
Fiber in and going with some big high-speed stuff. Correct. Yes.
less trouble?
Oh yeah, and we can scale it up too on the consortium. If we see that there's a demand hitting 60, 70, 80%, we can scale up past the 250 point. But as I said, generally we're watching that the traffic is not the problem is not the traffic between the building and the internet or the district and the internet. The problems tend to be internal to the district.
But I guess my point was that's more of just being a service provider and not necessarily a best practices or capacity building
Right.
service.
Yeah, again, I
correct?
think those are two separable tracks. That,
Right. Okay.
But again, our role is support for the districts. And I know that Lee is pretty busy, especially this time of year, getting all those 470s and 471s submitted on behalf of the districts to get them.
Thank you, Mr. Craven. We
Thank you for the
appreciate
chance to talk to y'all.
Thank you. Time, Dr. Chris Domaleski will lead us in a presentation and a discussion on what state testing looks like on a national level and how that some things that we've talked about in Mississippi, how that may be, give us some guidance there. Great.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. Thank you for inviting me to join you this afternoon. I look around the room. There's some familiar faces. Some of you I've seen before. Others may not be as familiar with me. I'm with a group called the. Oh, this clicker's not working here. Maybe I can just use it. Okay. I'm with a group called the National Center for the Improvement of Educational Assessment. We're based out of Dover, New Hampshire. And I have the privilege of working with the state's Technical Advisory Committee and with the Accountability Task Force. And we generally provide a range of technical support and services to the Department of Education. Thank you so much. To assist with well, we're going to figure out, here we go, to assist with design and validation of the state's assessment and accountability system. So we're a nonprofit group. We work with, I think we're in 38 states now. So have an opportunity to get a perspective from working with a number of states. And again, it's always a pleasure to be here in Jackson. Got 3 topics to talk about today, and I believe we could probably talk all afternoon about any one of them. So I'm going to be brief, and then I'm going to leave plenty of time for your questions, and we can engage in ways that meet the needs of the committee and help you advance the agenda that you have today, sir. First, reflect a little bit about testing time. It's perhaps a little more complicated than it seems on the surface, so let's just, I'll provide some reflections and insight about that, put you in touch with some research that I'm aware of on that topic. Also going to talk about considerations for using national tests and state systems, give you a bit of a perspective about what we've seen in other states, what we think are some opportunities and challenges there. And then finally, provide some guidance on formative interim assessment systems. So again, any one of those topics, I think we could talk at great length about. Okay, so let's start with testing time. To start with, let's acknowledge a bit of the complexity with the topic, and I'll tell you kind of the handle that I found on it for purposes of these remarks. When you talk about testing time, first you have to define it to some degree. What tests are we talking about? Talking about just the summative assessments, talking about district assessments, assessments that happen within the schools only. In general, the research I'm going to share with you is going to combine what we know from the summative assessments required by states and by required district assessments. Of course, that's not the total landscape of all the kinds of assessments that students encounter, but I think those are the ones people tend to think of as large-scale standardized testing events in the course of the school year. We also acknowledge there's a lot of differences across grades and among student groups. So for example, what a kindergartner experiences with respect to assessments is very different than, say, an 8th grader who's also a language learner, for example. There's just a different combination of assessments depending on what group the student's in, what grade the student's in, and other factors. So I'll try to acknowledge those as we go through the topic. Also want to be quick to say that even though we'll talk about assessment time in terms of duration of administration, of course, assessment burden goes well beyond simply the administration time. I'm assuming this is not an insight that's new to anybody in the room. Some people have compared it to taking a flight. You know, it only takes me, say, a couple hours to fly from Boston to Atlanta, but the whole time that it takes to go to the airport, to go through security, to wait at the gate, travel on the ground afterwards, and it's the better part of a day, right, in order to do that. So many people have used that metaphor to describe the impact that standardized testing has in schools. It may only be a 90-minute event, but there's a lot of preparation. There's a lot of ancillary burden that goes along with that, and I don't want to fail to acknowledge that. I certainly know that's a very real experience for schools when it comes to standardized testing, and of course scheduling disruptions that go beyond just simply the time commitment. Things like use of computer labs that can't be, there's an opportunity cost when they're not being used for other things as well. So again, there's some complexity to the topic that I certainly would be incomplete to not mention. There's a couple of published studies I wanted to let the committee know about. Again, I wish there were more that we could reflect on, so I've done a couple things for the purposes of this meeting. I'm going to reflect on the studies that I know of, and then tell you what I found in terms of some of the research, some of the things we've been able to find, just exploring what other states are doing. So Teach Plus put out a study in 2014, the student and the stopwatch. They looked at 12 urban districts. They quantified testing time as approximately 1.7% of the school year on required testing. What they included in that definition were state-required assessments and district-required assessments. So it didn't do classroom assessments and assessments that were specific to schools, but these were what we generally think of as benchmark or interim assessments, again, required by the district, in addition to the state summative assessment. About 10 hours they found were spent on language arts and 7 on mathematics for those 12 urban districts involved in this particular study. The Council of Great City Schools published a study in 2015. I've given the links to these because I'm just touching the surface of what is a much more complete report of their results. Certainly, committee members are invited to look at those in full at their leisure. They looked at 66 districts in this study, and their estimates are a little higher than the previous study. They found that I'm reporting out the grade in which there was the highest, quote, test burden, and that in this case was grade 8, where they found approximately 2.34% of instructional time, which translated to 4.2 days spent in required testing. They defined it the same way as district and state required assessments. And then the range typically fell in about 20 to 25 hours per grade through grades 3 through 11 across content areas. And of that, this study found that state tests varied from about 7 to 9 hours depending on the grade. So if you're asking what portion of that is just state required summative assessments, it's about 7 to 9 hours from among the 20 to 25 that they estimate as the total test burden for testing time. So let's talk a little bit about state summative testing in particular, which I think may be more of the immediate focus of this committee. My research and my experience in working with states, I would give the range for language arts as approximately 3 to 5 hours for most states. And you can find some states that are a little higher than 5, and you're going to find some states that may be a little shorter than 3, but that's a range in which I think you'll find the majority of states. And I'll give you plenty of state examples to help make my point there. Math tends to be a little shorter, tends to range for most states that we're seeing, again, state-required summative assessments in that 2 to 4 hour range. And of course, that's broken out in a lot of different ways. We may be talking about 3 hours in 2 90-minute sessions or 3 60-minute sessions. In many cases, states require a lot of flexibility in how that's organized. But in terms of the total amount of administration time that's dedicated for those testing events, that's a range that we find many states operate in for their statewide summative test. For the last day and a half, I've been here in this very room, in fact, with the State Technical Advisory Committee. We've, among the things we talked about were testing time, and we looked at some research with Mississippi in particular in testing time, and I can reflect on that as much detail as the committee would like. The ranges that are encumbered, I'm going to say, for testing in Mississippi tend to be a little over 4 hours, so 4.3 hours to 4.8 hours. And then for mathematics, we find that a little over 3 hours, so 3.2 to 4.1 hours. So in my judgment, Mississippi's testing times are close to the ranges we're seeing nationally, but probably a little on the higher end, which is it's probably fair to say that Mississippi's tests, the administration time is on the longer side, but still within what I would say is a broad swath or a critical mass of ranges that we're seeing nationally. Now, I will say it's not entirely clear to me, and that's one of the things the TAC and the MDE and all the providers are still working on studying, how much of that are what I think may be some very generous allowances for testing as opposed to actual time being spent on test. So we looked at some research actually just yesterday that looked at the distribution of testing time in language arts and mathematics that falls quite short of those total max testing times. But again, the state, I think, is erring on the side of caution and saying we want to encumber as much time as possible to ensure that time constraints aren't a limitation for a student showing what he or she knows on the assessment. So they may be a broad chunk of time is encumbered for the assessment, even though, let's say it's a 75-minute session, many students are actually finishing in 45 or 50 minutes. And so one of the things the Technical Advisory Committee is doing, working closely with the contractors in the department, is seeing where it may make sense to right-size those testing ranges a little bit to make sure that the time that's being encumbered really fits the amount of time that's right in terms of the student experience. We want to, we certainly don't want to put a new stressor on students that's going to add a burden or add a source of disruption in having the student show what he or she knows. But on the other hand, as I said, we want to right size it a little bit, and we can reflect on that a little bit later. And I've got a few other thoughts to add to that in just a moment. Other things you may be interested, what do we know about other state programs and how long they are? Two of the testing consortia in the country, Park and Smarter Balance. I think Park has 5 states in it now. Their range is about 3.75 to 4.5 hours for language arts. The reason there's a range is it varies by grade, a little bit different, say, for 10th grade than it is for, say, 3rd grade. And mathematics, that range is 3.5 to 4.5 hours. Smarter Balanced is the other assessment consortium. Their tests are a little bit shorter. I think Smarter Balance now has 12 states along with the Virgin Islands and the Bureau of Indian Affairs. So they've got 14 entities that are working with Smarter Balanced. And you can see those ranges there, about 3.5 to 4 hours for language arts, and maths about 2.5 to 3.5 hours. And I won't read all of this to you, but I thought you'd like to see just some examples of what other states are. And you might want to position Mississippi in that and say, where are we in terms of what other states are asking of their students? You could look at a state like Florida and say they go all the way up to 5 hours in some cases for language arts. Mississippi is a little bit shorter than that. But certainly you can look at a state like, say, Tennessee, which particularly for the math test is shorter than Mississippi state test. So there's some variance. Again, I think they tend to range in the units that I described previously, but they're you can sort of see for yourself where many of these states fall in terms of the time that's allocated for state summative test administration.
I know the one thing that we see as a district, and I think all districts see, is the longer the test is, are we testing stamina or are we testing skills? And so you have to build both up for students. But I mean, a lot of times, if it's such a long test, students do very well on parts of it, the first part of it, and their stamina runs out, and that is a concern, with the length of tests.
But I don't think it's premature for me to say now that the TAC did take head on this idea of, can we make the state assessments more efficient? And I think, again, working in close partnership with MD and the contractors, the answer is yes, we think we can. We think that there are some strategies to get, and again, here's our goal, and it's an ambitious goal, but I'm just going to share it directly with this committee here. We think we can not sacrifice the integrity of what's being assessed, the rigor of what's being assessed, or the comparability of assessments. So nobody at the department or in the TAC wants to disrupt what we think is a very strong, technically sound assessment system in the state, but still get a little bit of efficiency, which means that we can strategically tweak the content and the demands in a way that we can meet our long-term goals for the quality of the testing while lessening the burden. I think it'd be probably premature for me to say exactly what strategies we're looking at, because we have a program of research and investigation for that. But what we are hoping to do is consider a number of potential changes that we're carefully researching, where we can make alterations to the assessment that will reduce the testing burden in the coming years. And a target that we talked about yesterday in the TAC meeting was for the 2021 administration. I know that may sound pretty distal to members of this committee. Consider 2019 is pretty much in the books now. The build for 2020 happens as early as this summer or fall. So the TAC is really looking when as quickly as we can begin to make some changes to the assessment program. But again, we want to do it carefully. So it's kind of like a house of cards. We want to make sure we don't do anything that topples things.
I can say that from a district standpoint, that would be very beneficial for us, because just like Dr. Martin says, we start preparing because we do want to measure what our student knows, not their stamina, because so we encourage our teachers throughout the year to increase their testing time on task so that we can build their stamina. Some like running a marathon, and we've got to help increase so that our students can persevere through that longer assessment time, and we're actually getting towards the end, we're still getting their comprehension of the standard or the content that's been taught. So
I guess it doesn't look like we're that out of line there at all on the amount of testing that we're doing and comparing nationally. And I guess it goes back to what you're saying. I guess we're doing a lot of testing to prepare for the test.
Sometimes, yes, sir, I would agree with that statement.
And I think that's where, I'll be honest with you, I went into 3 school districts this year, one in many, but 3 were doing some testing at the time. And they had one of the halls taped off and tested, do not disturb, you couldn't go down it and all. And I asked another teacher if that was state testing. I knew it wasn't, but she thought it was. And this happened in 2 of the 3 districts when I asked someone when that was off if it was state testing, and they assured me, yeah, it was state testing. And whenever I pushed and asked the principal, of course, they said, no, it was not state testing. So I think even in the schools, they're getting mixed up with what is required and what is a state testing and what their district is requiring. And I don't know. I get you want to do a lot of the tests. You know, you want as a school board, as superintendent, as a teacher, you're held responsible for those scores. And I don't know if we put too much emphasis on the score or not. You know,
Speaking from a building level administrator standpoint, is that we want to do everything to help our children to be successful in the content and not let exterior or outside extraneous variables impact, because it's very hard for a student who does well, who has learned, and then because they haven't taken a test that has 60 questions on it before, they get to that 30 question mark and they're just wore out. So we want to be able, it's in the attempts in the building that you're talking about, is to mimic that game time situation as much as possible, so that our students are comfortable in that environment, so that the knowledge that they've gained comes through, not the pomp and circumstance of the situation.
I get it. That C district, that D or F district, I can imagine the pressure there on it, because the community's looking at it. Your principal's looking at it, your superintendent's looking at it. Even with A districts, to be honest with you, there's a lot of pressure, because I can tell you right now with Dr. Coleman down there, you better believe Long Beach, Pascagoula, Ocean Springs, they all going to look there to see who's where, and that's an A district. And there's pressure from the community to be successful.
It definitely is. From Clinton is an A district, and we feel it tremendously. But I think when we get to talking about district benchmarks and those things, I think there's a perception sometimes that there's something magic in giving a benchmark assessment, and there's nothing magic about giving a benchmark assessment. It's what you do with the data you get from it, and to drive your instruction and address weaknesses and promote strengths. The one thing that I think all districts need to make sure is, when a student takes a state test this week and going forward, the guarantee that every district should give is no surprises. There's not going to be anything on this test that you've not seen before, and that you have not had multiple opportunities to learn and master. I can't guarantee your performance, but I can guarantee your opportunity to have been taught it, and taught it at a high level in the context of how it's going to be done. And I think that's where, some districts that are struggling, it's like a team that's losing. Okay, is the answer practice harder, practice more, or what do you do? And so that's the dilemma I think some districts are in.
I guess the pressure on a kid or on a student, I guess I never really understood. I hear people say, there's so much pressure on this, especially a high school student, there's so much pressure on him to perform and all that. He's going home stressed out and all. Part of me wants to say, look, I worked at DuPont for years. You talk about, they've got to get out in the real world. There's going to be some stress there. And if a test is stressing you out, and the parents are saying, son's at Long Beach High School, and he was telling me the other day, I don't think they put the pressure, the emphasis that some school districts do. But he happened to say that this kid hit him up in the hall because the teacher was putting pressure and stuff on him. I knew the kid. The kid is an all-around, well-rounded kid, plays sports, and he's like a B student, solid CB student. He's not going to college. He's going to go to work for his dad. And he told my son out in the hall, he said, look, Mr. Bennett, they keep putting pressure on me, and he said they keep putting pressure on the teachers and all, and they're so worried about this test, and they say I'm not taking it serious. They wanted me to talk to you because I'm not taking the test serious. He says, I'm just going to be honest with you. He says, this test is about them and the school. He said, it's not about me. He said, I'm not going to college. I'm going to do okay on this test. But he said, I don't need the test for what I'm doing in life. And you know, I guess it kind of hit me with a little reality. That's the first time I heard one of the kids say, it doesn't matter what I do on this test. And he's right as far as his career. But I understand on the other side too. I mean, I don't even know how much these tests count other than, you know, ACT, SAT, those kind of hit on for scholarships. But it was kind of a point like it's really more about, but it's important. It's important to show that our kids are learning. It's important to show that they're getting the information that we're trying to teach them. So it's important that the fact that the state knows that they're getting the value for the money also.
I think we all have to realize as long as there's going to be schools, there's going to be tests.
Sure.
You can't have one without the other. And so, you know, it's just how we, you know, how we quantify that, how we make best decisions going forward. Tom Leske, go ahead.
Okay. So I'm happy, I'm going to switch topics now. I'm certainly happy to go backwards at any point and talk about testing time or any other aspect that the committee would like. But what again, there are three topics that I had prepared to provide remarks on. The second is about national tests. So it's a nice segue into different kinds of tests and different purposes. I think a good place to start, I know this may be familiar to many people in the room, so pardon me if this is a bit of a review, but starting with a acknowledgement of what federal law requires. The federal Every Student Succeeds Act laws requires that states test in every year in grades 3 through 8, and once in high school in language arts and mathematics. And the science testing requirement is once each in grades 3 through 6, 6 through 9 in high school, respectively. There are some flexibilities. I'm going to kind of put that in quotes a little bit in ESSA for testing. Again, I can talk about those as much as folks would like. They come in generally three flavors. One is the locally selected, nationally recognized high school assessment provision. I'm actually going to emphasize that one a little more than the other two. There's also a section in ESSA that allows states to submit for an innovative assessment pilot. Sometimes people will look past the fact that that pilot is intended to be in service to scaling up a statewide summative solution. Right now, I know of two groups that are pursuing a pilot. New Hampshire has been working on a pilot for a few years, and Louisiana has launched a pilot initiative fairly recently. So those are initiatives that are permitted in ESSA. And when I say a pilot, what they're doing is they're piloting some local assessments with the idea that they can demonstrate research and evidence that they can serve as a summative assessment and again be used statewide at a later point in time. No small task. And then there's the multiple interim provision. I actually don't know of any states that do that, but that was built into the law. So a state that says, hey, we don't want to do this end of the year waterfall assessment. We'd like to do some along the way assessments. Some people call that a through course model. When PARC was first developed, it was developed under that through course approach. ESSA provides for that, but I'm not aware of any state that currently takes advantage of that flexibility. Yes, ma'am.
Last week or two, the department there's been some conversation of waivers again for assessments.
So the department is always ostensibly open to waivers. So a state can submit for a waiver for some portion of ESSA. I know the Secretary of Education has said that waivers will be considered when a state can demonstrate that they're not trying to sidestep or obfuscate requirements, but that's in service to high standards and rigor. So I don't know that there's a specific window for that, but I do know that states can always apply for waivers. Mm-hmm. An important requirement that sort of cuts across everything in ESSA is that any test that's approved for use in ESSA must be submitted by the state to comply with federal peer review criteria. And I'm going to talk about what that is in just a minute. So in terms of national tests, and I know that ACT and SAT aren't the only national tests, but they're predominantly the tests we refer to when we say national test. We know of 25 states that require the ACT or the SAT statewide. 12 of those states incorporated in their accountability system in some form. And I know of 2 states that submitted the ACT to the U.S. Department of Education for it to be their high school test in compliance with ESSA. And those 2 states are Wisconsin and Wyoming. Both of those states submitted it for peer review. You can go online and read. It's a very public letter that they got back from the feds regarding the decision for their assessments. They aren't fully approved. I believe the category is substantially meets requirements, but there are findings that are outstanding for those assessments, primarily related to alignment, meaning that the states need to show that the content on the assessment matches their state content standards until they can be fully approved for use in the state. Yes, ma'am. Mm-hmm.
Actually state, I guess, a cut score that they would accept?
I believe so. I'm not sure if I know what that is by memory, but because the law was built around proficiency, they have to have some way to define proficiency for those assessments.
Establish that a student would have to have a certain score in order for that student to exit high school.
Right. Well, whether they're using it for student accountability that's tied to diploma eligibility is not certain to me. So that's not under federal auspices. The feds don't have any federal requirements for that. That would be a state initiative. Right. The ESSA requires that the state make a determination of proficiency, which is used in the accountability system. Right. Whether they did a state-specific cut or whether they're using the existing college readiness benchmarks for those assessments, I just don't know by memory, but they would have had to have some way to indicate proficiency. Yes, ma'am. Pardon me?
Exit exams or graduation.
The answer is I don't know if they're exit exams, but I know that that wouldn't be a federal requirement if they are using it for exit. So I mentioned peer review before, so I don't mean to overwhelm you with this chart, but also wanted to help folks get an appreciation for just how broad peer review is. I'm a former state assessment director, and I can remember putting our states through our state assessments through the peer review. And I know from my work here at the Mississippi Department, it's quite an undertaking to prepare the state's assessments for peer review. There are 30 elements that are checked. The name peer review refers to the fact that there are a national panel of peers that get together and evaluate all 30 of these elements related to reliability and validity and administration, monitoring, use, reporting, you name it. It's a fairly comprehensive evaluation. Some of the information is evaluated for compliance by the department staff. Others is judgment based by a panel of technical experts that make that determination. And the main message I wanted to share with you by giving you a glimpse into peer review is the depth of the technical requirements that states must demonstrate in order to show that any assessment, certainly a national assessment, is suitable for state usage under ESSA. And some of the things that we find in order to meet those standards federally, as I mentioned with Wyoming and Wisconsin, alignment to the full breadth and depth of Mississippi state standards is would be one consideration, that there is that correspondence with the state's content standards. Ensure that inclusion of all groups, including language learners and students with disabilities, is appropriate. Accommodations and accessibility features are consistent with state policy. Assessments need to show that they measure the full performance continuum. I like to remind folks that these assessments were originally developed to be readiness for higher education, so they're not designed for the full performance continuum. So that's a consideration that any state considering adopting it would need to study it specifically for. Availability and comparability for administration mode. By that I mean the range of like paper and pencil, computer, what devices are used, what platforms will it be accessible on. And when you work with a company with an intact assessment like College Board or ACT for SAT or ACT respectively, and certainly lose a little flexibility. Right now, the state has contracts with providers, whether custom developments and deployments, where they have some sway in these kinds of decisions. And I think it's certainly no understatement to say that a state would lose some of its flexibility working with a national assessment, which is an intact assessment. And in fact, I might even share, even just this morning, I saw an article where Arizona had proposed to use ACT as part of its state accountability system, and may be facing some federal pushback on that related to alignment and related to accessibility features. So the fact that it's a very real outcome that states are working to address these issues. I believe that's the last slide I had on national assessments. I'm happy to pause here and take any questions the committee has on this topic.
Want to have any questions? Those of you on the phone, any questions?
None at this time.
Oh, okay. Hearing none, I have one more topic. I appreciate the committee's patience. This one's going to be probably the broadest topic in terms of the reflections that I have. So again, I'll appreciate any direction or any follow-up the committee has. One of the areas I was asked to speak to is just what are some general guidance and best practices when it comes to implementing an assessment system. And I certainly applaud the inquiry. I think that's the right question to be asking. One of the things that we psychometricians say is that it's if you ask a test to do everything well, it almost certainly does nothing well. So we do advocate that solutions for assessment that are built on comprehensive assessment systems is the right way to think about it. So again, I'll provide some insight from our work in other states, and again, happy to answer any questions here. So this may be a review for some. I'm reflecting on an article in Educational Measurement Issues and Practices. It's a journal in our field that my colleagues Mary Ann Perry, Scott Marion, and Brian Gong wrote in 2009, where it's sort of the source for defining the terms that refer to the categories of assessments. We talk about summative assessments, generally given at the end of the unit, typically part of an accountability program or informs policy. That's probably the one that's most familiar and visible to many stakeholders and users of assessment. Formative assessment, we think of that as a process that's used during instruction to provide feedback. Purpose is typically tied to diagnosis. We want to learn where students are in their learning and help improve learning. I often like to say that formative assessment is best used as a verb and not a noun. It really refers to a set of practices that are employed around assessments. You can't really refer to a specific test or collection of items as a formative assessment. It really matters how you're using that assessment, whether or not you peg a formative use case to it. Interim assessments is that middle ground in between. They kind of fall between formative and summative, medium scale, medium cycle assessments. I think people have come to use the term benchmark as well to refer to what others call interim assessments. They're used for sometimes lower stakes accountability. A district may use it for evaluation, auditing, other kinds of purposes. And you see the pyramid there on the right. Tell us a little bit about the sort of the footprint we'd expect those assessments to have in a comprehensive system. So we think of formative, these classroom assessments being very broad, very frequent, very focused, summative being much less frequent, and certainly much less of a footprint in the assessment cycle. So when we think about designing an assessment system, so if somebody were to ask, what does it look like to put together a system of formative, interim, summative assessments that work well for various purposes, the first thing that we like to say at the center is, well, let's talk what the use cases are. And I've listed some of them here. I won't read them all to you, but there's a lot that we can ask of assessment. Do you want to use it for screening? Do you want to use it to measure along the way learning? Is it end of unit expectations, predictions, so forth and so on? So the purpose of an assessment is really integral to the design decisions for an assessment system. And we also consider, is the usage intended to be kind of at the student level? Do we want to claim about what a student knows and can do to inform instruction for that student? Or, we can imagine designing an assessment system that provides feedback more at the school or the district level. And not to get too technical with you, but you might consider something like a matrix design program where students don't take the same items, but we aggregate different collections of items across in order to make inferences about the school or the district. So all of that's just in service to the point that the design decisions really get pegged to the prioritized use cases and to the unit at which the claim is to be made about the assessment outcomes. I like to say form follows function, and that's the way it is with assessments. The other thing is we certainly understand that efficiency is a big part of this as well, and maybe a metaphor I'll use is, if you're joining a gym because you want to get fit, a good strategy is not to just walk in the gym and start randomly using different machines. Some of them are going to be less helpful. Some of them won't be tied to your fitness goals. Some of them may be redundant. A smart approach would be to say, I'm going to identify my fitness goals. Maybe it's strength, maybe it's endurance, maybe it's weight loss, something like that. And I'm going to put together a program that's most efficiently and effectively designed for me to get to that result. And I'll be led to a set of tools and practices that will best help me to get there. So increasingly, we're finding those conversations occurring in the assessment world, as opposed to just saying, let's collect a lot of different products and put them together and we'll hope for the best in terms of outcomes. So some of my colleagues at the center recently put out this paper at an annual conference we have called the Reedy Interactive Lecture Series, addressing the challenges and opportunities of balanced assessments. And they identified 5 criteria that I thought would be good to share here with the group for, so if you're asking me, what should I look for in a good assessment system to know that it's well designed and it's doing what it should? And some of the things I would mention is, do we have coherence? Is it compatible with how the students expected to progress in the domain? We talk about both vertical and horizontal coherence. So I would expect, for example, a school and district assessment program to be coherent with the state assessment program. That's what we mean by vertical. And by horizontal, we mean just the course of instruction that a student's engaged in. Does it follow the assessment program? We always want the dog wagging the tail and not vice versa. We should never see assessment driving instruction. We always want instruction to drive assessment. Certainly comprehensive. We want a system to do multiple things for multiple groups. Again, I know I'm going brisk now because I don't want to overtalk my welcome here and I want to get to your questions. Continuity. We certainly want to minimize disruptions in assessment programs so we can monitor and evaluate progress over time. Another expression that's common in our field is if you want to measure change, don't change the measure. So continuity certainly is important there. Increasingly, we're seeing attention on utility, so information to support intended uses. Are reports clear? Is there guidance for how to interpret and how to use the results? I think, and I use the phrase theory of action here, which is important to us. That is that we can know and explicitly state and demonstrate that the assessment system's pegged to a system of use that is clear, can be articulated and demonstrated. So, for example, an impoverished theory of action would be, we're just going to give the assessments and hope people use them well. A more complete theory of action is, we're going to measure what teachers should be teaching and students should be learning. We're going to provide guidance and support for how to interpret and use results. We're going to take action based on that guidance and support. We're going to monitor and evaluate over time. Hopefully you see the point here that making that compatible with the assessment system is really what a more comprehensive solution looks like. And I sort of mentioned efficiency already. We want to avoid any kind of redundant or superfluous design choices. Probably not necessary to have a normative assessment, another progress monitoring assessment, an assessment for growth. We can ask some assessments to serve those things in different ways. We don't need to just load one on top of another. Almost to my last slide. Thanks for your patience. When it comes to formative and interim assessments, I think if I could just leave you with one thought, it's lead with content. Good assessments must demonstrably measure what is valued. If we don't know what's on the assessment, if we can't provide evidence that it's aligned strongly with what should be taught and learned, then that would be a priority to address. And that kind of goes with integration with curriculum. If there's a way to provide focused, clear, and useful feedback on a regular basis, I mentioned again that design decisions are best made at a system level. So if we're asking ourselves, you know, how is this assessment going to fit in? It's best to think about the full system of assessments in the curriculum, as opposed to restricting that inquiry to simply one particular assessment. We found in some of the work, I say we, I mean my colleagues at the National Center, really can't overemphasize building on capacity to assess and interpret and use results effectively. That's such a key ingredient. It goes beyond just simply the items on the test, and the importance of monitoring, evaluating, and refining those systems over time. So I know this, whoops, went the other way. I know that might have been a little bit like drinking from a fire hose. I appreciate your patience, but I wanted to provide my reflections on assessment systems. And again, I'm happy to address any questions that the committee has.
Questions?
Comment.
Yes, ma'am.
Dr. Domaleski, is not actually for you, it's more for the department. Your ending comment to me is the most important, specifically around making guide and instruction. And if we could have more and more professional development around that for districts, it would make a difference. Because right now, what we see sometimes as practitioners are people really trying to emulate a practice situation. So they just continue to give more and more tests without actually using the information from those assessments, either with their teachers or their students. And so how to continue to build that capacity is really the professional development that I think is really needed out in the field.
I'd like to piggyback on that just a little bit too, though. And the improvements are being made with the report card and getting more information from the state test. But I will tell you, we get more actionable data that drive instruction from our interim assessments that we use from vendors than we do from the state assessment. The state assessment is our end game. It's our scoreboard, and we know how we ended the year. But as far as the following year, the next year, how do we drive? You know, we don't get item analysis. We don't get things that we get from interim assessments that we use vendors. And so if we could get more actionable data from our state assessment, then I think the reluctance, the dependence on interim assessments might be diminished some. In our district, one of the things that we did to try to reduce testing was, since we were getting the results back in a timely fashion, we used to do 3 interim assessments, a beginning to get a starting point, a midpoint, and an end. Since we were getting scores back in a timely fashion, we said, okay, we're going to do away with this first test. We've got the end of the year scores of where the kid ended the year, so we know a starting point. And that did away with a whole, set of testing that our district was doing, and our teachers were, great, that's wonderful. And then we do a middle one and an end one. But if we had more actionable data, and there's steps in the right direction as far as the report card and some of those reports. But I mean, from our vendors, I get the whole data set, and I can run and play and do things with it and break that data up. We don't get that. We get a score report. We get things that we have to find ways to make it actionable ourselves.
I do appreciate it. We had the conversation around the power standards and the blueprints. I do think that information
Yes.
is really
So it steps in the right direction.
Right. But I agree with Dr. Martin in terms of the end of the year assessment. We actually tend to use it more around teachers than we actually do for students. And so, but again, that's a capacity issue. And I think all too often we're having these conversations almost like districts are having the same conversations around how do we build each other's capacity. And the districts that really need to be sitting at the table having that type of professional development are not in the room. And so when I read the Mississippi First report, and I saw districts that were using multiple assessments for the same purpose, to me, that is a capacity issue in terms of leadership. Because there's no way that you should continue to use the same assessment and use multiple assessments for the same purpose. So, I mean, that's not good, bad, or indifferent, but to me, I think that's a training component that we just have to continue to try and have with building leaders. Because otherwise, they will continue to try and emulate this, this practice field that Dr. Martin mentioned earlier, trying to make sure if they practice really, really hard, then the end result will be great, and those two don't necessarily correlate at all. So. I just think they need more, a lot of people need more training.
I'll just offer a few reactions to that, and I appreciate the question and the comment. I think you hit the bullseye, absolutely. And again, fresh from TAC, we spent a day and a half talking about testing issues, and your reflections really mirror so much of what we talked about. We talked about, and again, with summative assessments, I think the TAC both has an appropriate sense of humility about not overstretching them beyond what they're designed to do, but at the same time trying to really get as much information out of them in a format that is as useful as possible. We talked about some strategies. We, with Dr. Wright's leadership and working with the contractors in the department, really challenged ourselves to further develop that out and try to develop a more mature plan for how we can do that in the coming administrations. We also talked about, like, how can we, I don't want this to just be rhetoric, but how can the department be a leader in providing resources and clarity to districts regarding good formative and interim practices, at the same time respecting the autonomy of districts to make their choices. So again, the TAC talked about, what are ways we might be helpful without being disruptive. Are there some ways to help states understand districts to understand the quality of assessments, some best use case practices, and that's going to be an ongoing topic and one that I hope that you'll see some movement on in the coming. I don't even want to say the time frame because I don't want to pledge what I can't deliver, but in the future.
Very good. Thank you, Dr. Domaleski.
Yes,
Please
sir.
stay there because we're going to maybe using you in some questions if you
Sure.
don't mind. What we'd like to do, as I mentioned earlier, the original intent, if we had enough task members here, we were going to break out into some small groups and try to tackle 4 main areas that we've talked about in the 2 presentations already. Benchmark interim testing, teacher concerns and frustrations around testing, ideas about state testing and what could be done differently, and then technology concerns. And knowing that this task force is not a decision-making body, we just make recommendations, and then the department can take those and do with those as they would like. But I've asked Dr. Stephen Hampton from Lower County if he would lead us, and we've been talking all around it, and let's kind of quantify.
Dr.
benchmark
Coleman, you're right
interim
on
testing.
track. But I appreciate the opportunity to talk about a topic that's kind of near and dear to my heart as far as the benchmark and interim assessments. And, I guess we've been in this almost a year now in this task force, and so we've had so much information, and I think it's now time that we can come together and have a participatory discussion from the committee members or the task force members on what are some recommendations that we can make moving forward with benchmark and interim assessment. And so I will go ahead and lead off one of the recommendations that I would like to suggest, or Dr. Martin and I talked about, and Dr. Coleman just hit it right on the head, is for MDE to provide more professional development because I think it's so important this because there was no strong correlation, let's put it that way, on how much time was testing or how much test was work. It's what you do after the test. And so to provide some districts professional development on making data-driven instructional decisions based on those benchmark or interim assessments, so that they don't have to test more. They use the data they're getting to be able to drive their instruction, either on a quarterly or try it 3 times a year or whatever, and we're like you, we drop down to 2 times a year. So that would be my recommendation to the task force. I'd like to entertain any other recommendations, and if you have any other further discussions about more professional development on data-driven instruction, data-informed instruction using interim benchmark assessments data to inform instruction.
I'd like to offer as a secondary recommendation that needs to be, I guess, scaffold. There needs to be one session for superintendent. Also need that same type of training for teachers, and I'll even step out and say that as we look at colleges of education, and as we receive students, not only student teachers but also novice teachers, there is a lot of work that can be done also with our colleges of education in terms of preparing students to their students to actually not only understand assessment, but also understand the instructional process that needs to be, I guess, driven by this entire process. All too often when we inherit students from colleges of education, and I can almost pinpoint them based on their attitude around assessments of where they went to school in the state of Mississippi. And I'll just leave that there. But that is a fact of life, as Dr. Martin said. And so again, MDE has program approval over colleges of education. I think the same conversation needs to be had there, so that when they hit our doorsteps for jobs, they also have a really good understanding of not only assessments, but also how to use those assessment results. So Steve, that's my recommendation on your recommendation.
But yeah, thank you very much. I appreciate that. So let me just kind of reiterate what you were saying. So along with the professional value, you want scaffold from superintendent, building, and teacher level, but also on student teaching as far as the program of instruction at IHL, looking into those to be able to provide better data-informed instructional decision-making in that teacher prep courses. Yeah. I would hesitantly recommend a frequency because I don't know, each district is different. We felt in our district that those benchmark assessments, say for us it was NWA, we were giving it 3 times a year. We felt like our teachers came to us and said that, you know, this is too much, and so we're losing instruction, so therefore we backed off. But then ironically, as we backed off of it this year, I had many, because of my role as Director of Accountability and Research, many teachers contact me, and also building level principals, saying that they wish they would have done the 3 times a year too, because they felt like they were just because, and it was great for me because it told me our teachers are really using this benchmark assessment to inform their instruction, and they didn't have that data point to inform their instruction, so they felt like they were out there kind of blindly feeling their way, and so they really missed that and so we just had a principals meeting this morning in our district, and started asking them to think about, where do we go from here? What does it look like? What adjustments we make? Do we go back to 3 times a year, or do we stick with 2 times a year and just different times, up 2 times, different times? So instead of testing in the fall, we test the winter and the spring test, and then use the spring in the fall of the next year to. So those are some of the sketches. So it just depends on the assessment, I would say. So I would hesitantly say I would recommend a number of interim or benchmark assessments. Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, personally, I would say yes. I would find something that's good and stick with it. From the data from the survey, I didn't see anywhere where it really distinguished that using one was better than 2 versus 3, this, that, and the other. There was really nothing that said that, you know, higher performing districts only used 1 type of benchmark assessment or 2 benchmark assessments. So it was really inconclusive to that point in the survey results. But I can say personally, and from correct. I would,
I don't
I would
wanna-
go
I don't want
back
it
to
to
what Dr. Coleman's saying too, is that the more capacity they have to determine what data they're getting is helping inform, the more they'll weed out benchmark assessments that are not as useful. So I think that capacity building is a key to that, so that they can interpret, analyze the data to inform their instruction. And once they see that improvement from that instruction, they'll start seeing the data that says this benchmark assessment might not suit our purposes as well as this one, and so we're going to.
I think that PD training needs to, we all cliche, we all suffer from the drip syndrome, data rich, information poor. That, too many districts are taking their interim assessments, they're taking their state assessments, and they take it down, they look at it at the district level, they look at it at the school level, they look at it at the teacher level, but it never makes it down to the student level. If you don't put a face with every one of those numbers, then nothing ever changes. If you don't put a child with every one of those scores, that it actually is a child and what they need, then nothing ever changes, because you're going to continue to do the same practices again. You're going to get the same results at the district level, at the school level, at the teacher level. It's got to get down to individual children and what it looks like for them. And so that training needs to be, exhaustive. And I know that's difficult for the, department. That's really a job of districts, but I think guidance needs to be given to districts on what does that look like? What is good? What is best practices?
I feel like I might frustrate people when I answer this, but my honest answer is we'd really have to have a conversation of what are the primary uses. But I certainly, I think the idea that the committee is talking about certainly seems very strong to me, which is, I think if I were trying to design something on the fly, what I'd say is maybe we could come up with, say we, then the department could come up with some recommendations for this set of use cases. These recommendations are strong. So if say growth or prediction are your primary aims, if you're mostly interested in measuring deeper learning, getting the harder to measure, more cognitively complex concepts that go beyond what we so often see on summative assessments, here are some good design choices. Here are some good practices. We might even be able to add some advice about frequency. But on the fly, my thought is perhaps some different sets of guidance could be developed based on different outcomes. But you can probably see, there's a lot of combinations here, and maybe one of the things we can work with this committee or other stakeholders to see what are the use cases that should be prioritized, and that can help, I think, the department and others to craft guidance that will be most beneficial to the field.
Any other recommendations around that topic?
I just want to echo that I don't think we can, especially based on the survey results, say that you shall only administer these many interim assessments or benchmark assessments. I just think that would create an even larger firestorm out in local districts as far as testing. I think that they would feel like their home rule authority as a local district was being diminished if the state tried to start telling them that. That's just my honest opinion. I think that's overstepping the bounds. I think that we have to approach it from developing the capacity through professional development and best practices.
I think the accountability system already does that. I mean, the account. I know that it's easy for me to sit here as a high performing district and say, hey, what we're doing is working, but at the same time, there are best practices for districts and schools that are being successful, and so when you talk about capacity, it's up for those districts and schools that are struggling to reach out, and we're open to sharing and reaching out, because really at the end of the day, we always talk about we compete on Friday nights, but every other time of the year we better be working together or we all sink. And I think that's, we have developed some consortiums in the metro area where all of our middle school principals get together, our high school principals get together, and that needs to be maybe led by the department, or it needs to just be organic, across the state. I know this that in the South, y'all have consortiums and you get together, and when districts get together and share best practices, maybe the department could lead in the effort of having, regional meetings where people get together, and it's not sit and get where the department is telling us the mandates and things that are going on. This is a time to come and get together and share best practices, and lead that discussion, because when that happens, every time we get together with other districts, you learn something more and you learn something new and better. It just makes you better.
Jump out here one thing and I agree with you. I'm for home rule on all these, but I'm going to be the bad guy here. I'm going to be in the minority here. I think because there's so much on social media, so much out there saying too much testing, that the legislature or somewhere is going to come back to local districts. And I don't think that we ought to ever legislate what local will be in the next school board member. It needs to be locally. But just like I said, when I went in these schools and these teachers were believing this was state testing, it's easy to shove it off on social media and everywhere and say it's the Department of Education, it's the legislature, we're doing too much testing. And that's, it's not really the State Department of Education forcing all these tests. But for whatever reason, it's easy to push it on the State Department and the legislature. And I just hope it doesn't get to a point where the legislature gets fed up and says, we're going to stop these local districts from doing all this testing. And I really believe it needs to be home rule, and I believe that's a school board decision or a superintendent's decision on what's best needed in that district. But somehow we've got to get the message out that what we're doing is outside of third grade gate. Of course, we give ACT and 11th juniors. History is not required federally. And let me say something about that. One of the biggest critics that I hear on Facebook and all, and she's a friend, is about testing. She's a social studies, she's a history teacher. And, there was a little bit of kick around about not making that mandatory anymore. She was the first one to complain to me, and other teachers like, you're meaning our subject isn't as important as the others. And again, whenever I was in school, that's what they gave the coach to teach. They gave him PE, health, or history or social studies because it wasn't held at a standard of the other grades. So I mean, you get kicked no matter what you want to do.
Darn if you do, darn if you don't.
Right.
Yeah.
And to be honest with you, I think it's a fair thing to test history and social studies. I think it's so important. I mean, if you look today, people don't know the history of the country or anything, but again, at the same time, I agree with you all that I think it's home rule that you should be able to do the assessments how you want to do them in home rule. But dang, I mean, MDE gets beat up, we get beat up.
And I think that following that, it could be a situation of not informing our parents and students of that these assessments, even the benchmark, see, we use these benchmark and interim assessments formatively. This is to measure learning. This is not a gotcha moment. This is not a, the only, in our district, we preach that the only summative final grade that you really get is that final state test. Everything else we're going to use to drive our instruction, drive our learning. And I guess when I was in school, it was always bad to have a test, and so I think as educators, we've moved more to assessment being something that's guiding instruction, whereas the old way of thinking about tests in the public's eye is it's a gotcha moment. You know what I'm saying? And every test you take is, hey, I got you, and you fail, and that's it. Yeah. But that's the furthest can be from the truth, because even in that situation, I guarantee in those districts where they roped off and did that, they used that assessment data. I will promise you, if they went to the link to mimic the state test, they went the extra mile and took that assessment data and drove that instruction to guide and help better find the deficiencies of students or opportunities to even go past of what in enrichment. We talk so much about so much about intervention and remediation, but we also look at enrichment of students. And you can't go past, if a lot of our discipline problems, I'm convinced, come from students who already know the content and they're bored. And so even that assessment can help us identify those students who know that content and enrich their learning even more. So, I just think that maybe it's maybe even an image problem of testing, because everybody in the public, parents, and I took a test today, Mom, and why are they testing so much? And I hate tests. And so then they got the avenue of social media to say what they want to say.
And, and there's perceptions out there too that we have an exit exam, and you've heard it before. Valedictorian, salutatorian didn't pass the exit exam, and well, that's just not true. And I'm going to tell you right now, if you've got a valedictorian, a salutatorian who couldn't pass the exit exam for high school, you've got something wrong in your school district. Now, I'm just telling you straight up, but that's not the case. And there's not the exit exam. They said, I think maybe at one time they may have been used as an exit exam, and I guess that's just resurfacing continuously, and you just can't get rid of it.
Well, I've always made the statement. I mean, the state test, they serve a purpose and accountability system. You're not going to go into SEC football country and take the scoreboards down at Bryant-Denny Stadium. You're just not going to do that. I mean, we play the game for a reason. You get a score. Well, we have an accountability system for a reason. Everybody wants to be an A district. Well, how do you get there? You need to, and the tests drive the instruction. I mean, they're gauging what students have mastered that year. Again, I go back. It always comes back to capacity, and I think that's the job of maybe it's not the sole purpose of the department, but that is part of the department and districts, is to build capacity to be better.
So to wrap up and we're going to make the recommendation that we ask MD. The recommendation would be to ask MDE to provide more data analysis to inform instruction and have it scaffold separate training or professional developments for super level administration, building level administration, and teachers, and to build that capacity on all three levels. And then also looking to conversations with IHL for teacher prep purposes, and starting that conversation with those newly budding instructors that we have coming in. So, any other recommendations from the task force for benchmark or interim assessments?
I have one,
okay.
And it kind of captures the entire discussion that I've heard thus far. My team recently spent some time taking apart the Access for All guidance document, and I want to commend the members of MDE for coming up with such guidance regarding how to really look at the struggles that students have. So as I listen to the discussion about building capacity around benchmark assessments, once those trainings are conducted throughout our state, I think it will be critical to create a guidance document that districts can continue to use to build capacity even beyond the live professional development session.
Point well taken.
I don't think necessarily, I'll just say this, I don't think necessarily it's up MDE, but MDE might be, and we can crowdsource, because our district has documents that we use for data analysis for NWA, and that we might just be able to put it out there for everyone to see. You kind of crowdsource or that, and so you can put that out there, as sharing, So, I agree with the guidance document, but I think it could be compiled and maybe organized through MDE. And hey, can you share us what you're doing for Case 21 or MD or even because I'm going to tell you, we're in the process of building some very good in-district benchmark assessments. And so even there is a different type of form for that. So anyway, I just was throwing it out.
Maybe a clearinghouse for best practices. Yeah.
I agree. That's it, Tim. A clearinghouse.
Right.
Document sheets that principals fill out that we all study, those have been created in time. not anything that we bought over the years.
I agree. I don't think it's really about the document, but it's the decision you make beyond the document. Because someone said it earlier, we're all data-rich and information poor in some cases. So being able to know how to shift the practice from an instructional standpoint, I think, is really where that work rests in that particular document.
Okay,
This is Eddie Casson. Just real quick, just to add to this discussion before we move on. I just want to make sure that we don't lose. It's being said that we're doing more testing. I don't think that we're doing more testing in most cases. I think that teachers did their individual tests at one time, and they did final exams and things like that. These assessments we just changed the way that we're assessing. I think in most cases we're doing district or common assessments in the place of those. In most cases, I know in my case that the teachers that used to do their own big exam at the end of their course or at the 9 weeks, this has replaced it. So we're not doing more. I just want to make sure that we're not losing that. And these tests are being seen and used at the district level, and the results and the data is being used. The data are being used as a district in a way to help teachers and give the teachers resources to improve instruction for teachers. So I just don't want to lose that. I just wanted to add that to that discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Bazant. We've got 3 other topics. I want us to get out of here by 4 o'clock, so we need to move. Let's move quickly on. Kelly Riley, teacher concerns. That was a big part of the survey and teacher concerns there.
Well, in the survey, you'll remember our handout from the last meeting summarized most of the concerns into 15 broad categories, and looking at the top 5, too much testing, bad tests, bad data, kid stress, loss of instructional time, which is probably the largest concern that I hear from our members, and teacher stress. And so actually, in thinking about the meeting today, I think so much of this ties into the recommendation that we've already come up with related to we've got to address the capacity of, and Benita, you made a good point with the scaffolding, not only the administrators, but the teachers. Why are we testing, and how are you using the test data to drive instruction? So professional development was actually the recommendation that I had come up with. I know as an association, that's something that we can do through our regional trainings for our classroom teacher members. Unfortunately, the kids' stress and the teacher stress, I think part of that is just a result of the accountability system. And that's if you looked at the comments, y'all, they're so telling. The comments that were included in the closing of the PowerPoint, I can't teach because I'm teaching the standards, I'm teaching the curriculum.
I'm asking in an honest way. I help me.
I think it's just the qualitative. What I hear from our members is that they've lost that one-on-one relationship piece, as everything is driven by, we have to cover this, it's on the test, it's this standard. And so that relationship building piece has been lost to some degree, I think. Joyce, what?
Being in the classroom and teaching a state testing area template for years. And I taught gifted students, so I felt like I was teaching the content rather than the test at first. So then when my students were not growing and I was called in and whipped about that, I went to the other teachers and I said, okay, what am I doing wrong? And they said, you're not teaching the test. So then I had to go back. Now, I have also taught I've taught for ACT testing and PSAT testing. Those tests, and there is a way to teach how to take the test, how to think through a question. All of you are educators, you know what I'm talking about. So when I took that strategy, which took away from creative writing, college prep writing, college prep reading, preparing for the ACT, helping, doing those kinds of things, and reading deep diving reading, which I thought was part of preparing for that test, then it took away, I was teaching how to take the test. I was going through test questions, and I was saying, okay, how do you think through this question? Is this, you have 4 answers, one of them's awful, one of them's this, one of them's that. So what a lot of teachers are doing is taking the testing model or example, and they're teaching, that's what a lot of them mean by teaching the test. They're literally teaching the test. But I'll tell you what happened when I started teaching the test. My scores came up. My students started whipping that out, and we're doing fantastic because they learned how to take the test. Now,
I gotta push back on this one because with MCT2, which was total regurgitation, that tactic may have worked. But with the new assessments, that strategy does not.
But I think that still some of the teachers in the classrooms are still, I may not be the tactic, and I hadn't been out of the classroom that long, and I've been in contact with teachers, and I think a lot of them are still thinking in those lines. Whether that's what they're supposed to do or not, I don't know. The other thing is about the student test stress. My grandson's in 3rd grade, so all year long. I mean, the very first week of school, he came in and said, guess what? I have to pass a test at the end of this year, and if I don't go to 4th grade. Exactly. And then from then on, and then the last time I was home, he was getting ready for the state testing window, and he explained to me what his scores were all year long and told me how many points he had to grow. And if he didn't grow that many points, then this, and this. Now, that's individual down to the student. That's down to the student. His teacher had exactly what he had to do. That was down to the student. Now, on one hand, I was going, yes. I was, okay, you're doing great, fella. You understand how important that test is. And at his school, they're cheerleading. They had to come to school 15 minutes early to do a cheerleading thing, and I think most schools are doing that. And he was so excited to get up, and go to school and participate in this test. And he didn't see it as stressful, but then he sees nothing as stressful. And so, I understand and I hear the teachers. We're listening to the teachers. We're listening to the students. So my idea and my recommendation about this for the teachers is maybe we need to have a little more professional development about how to approach this testing window and how to deal with it with the students. We had students present at the beginning of our task force, and they told you how stressful it was, and those students were the top-notch kids in the class. And yeah, so I don't want to keep going.
And this is anecdotal, but I've just noticed on social media in the last 5 days, posts from parents of encouraging notes they've given their children, thanking the teachers, praying for the teachers as the testing window opens. And so it really has, which is good because it's, the students are understanding. It is getting down to that student level. But it's, it struck me in the last few days.
I see teachers talking to parents about the test. It ought to be about their kids and their grades and all. I go to different schools and you just see it. I don't know if it's leadership. I don't know what it is. They're so different when you go. I've gone to some, well, I was a, I don't know what I was, principal of the day, teacher of the day, something at Ocean Springs. So I went around as principal checking these teachers. No. I mean, everything was upbeat. I mean, it was, and then I go into others and it is like stressed out. It's the atmosphere in the school is totally different. And everything's quiet and blocked off and we're doing testing and there's a lot of pressure. And then I go to schools where everything's upbeat and fun and the teaching's fun and they're doing innovative things, not necessarily in the classroom, but out in the schoolyard or out in the gym with a mathematics or something. And I don't know. I get the pressure of teachers. I get the pressure for them to perform. There's no doubt. Teacher of 20 years ago and what a teacher is today is a whole different ball game. And
that, and just to add to that teacher stress, etc. When we have teachers who are being literally being fired because their test scores are not what they're supposed to be, and you have, certain teachers who can do that testing and be very successful, others are not. But what's the key to this teacher being successful and this teacher not being successful? When some, and I've told this story in this very room, when some districts are putting first-year teachers who are, don't know anything into those testing because the other teachers don't want it. Now, going back to your district, Dr. Coleman, you put a first-year teacher, or they did, in one, and he was dynamic in there with the energy and prepared for that thing. But so many districts use the testing against the teachers to either non-renew them or put them in such an extremely uncomfortable situation that, of course, the teachers are going to say to the students, if you don't succeed, my job is on the line. And that happens quite a bit.
but Joyce, to be fair, if a teacher's not performing, what is your suggestion?
That's not always the case.
No, it's not always, but I said a lot of times it is if they're not performing. What should be the end result?
Development to help the teacher grow, to develop. And I'll be the first to admit that there are some teachers that don't belong where they are. I'll be the first to admit. But in our situation, we have teachers who could be very successful in ninth grade English, but they're put in another area, and given that stress of performing, then they're not able to do their best. And they have second and third jobs that also hurt them to be able to do their best.
I think all of
The
us.
whole thing is pulling against them and making them stressful. So when it's testing winter time, they just feel like that the whole, their success, their students, when it's a school-wide thing, but then when it comes down to it, a lot of teachers are put on the chopping block because of
I would say it's hard to non-renew a teacher due to test results because the contracts are due. We've already signed our contracts, and the assessment results don't come back until end of June.
It's
Only
based
because it's
on
5 minutes before and I got to drive 3 hours. Is there a recommendation? I mean, is a
We
recommendation
heard
not to put
professional
new
development. We
service,
did hear
new
professional
teachers?
development.
development.
But is there a recommendation around maybe cautioning districts around putting novice teachers in tested subjects? I don't know. Is that a recommendation?
I don't know if I agree with that recommendation because I have novice teachers in tested subjects
I
that
do.
are outperforming veteran teachers.
I do too.
I think one recommendation would be to look at the culture that leaders create around testing. Coming in as a new superintendent in an environment that was heavily focused on getting kids ready for the test, and then realizing the new standards allow for so much flexibility in teaching standards so that teachers can do those creative things that I've heard so many of you speak about. So I think some of the recommendation really needs to be around the type of culture that we create in our districts and our schools around testing. Meeting with parents and teachers in my district, I have heard the concerns and the frustration around it, but then what we've also done is looked at how can we scale that? How can we have the right conversations about how the results should be used so that it's not punitive, but it's more informative and it allows us to adjust instruction. So that's really on leaders from my standpoint.
That the communication directors, I mean, could we include professional development with them as far as the district's communication plan to parents and the community as a whole on testing? I mean, that was just one outlet or mechanism that I had thought of.
Let's move on to number 3 real quick. We've got about 5 minutes. So technology, we talked about it. We had a presentation earlier today from Mr. Craven, Dr. Sanders. Technology concerns, or there's some recommendations that we might can come around.
Well, I'd like to say that I think Mr. Kramer did a great job explaining some of the issues, and the only recommendation that came to mind, even listening to his presentation, was probably again around capacity in some areas, in some districts where there's some struggling, where it's real things that happen around testing, where people maybe have not done due diligence prior to, and you're getting there on test day and you're trying to cash or do whatever those things, which is way too late. But there may be some type of, I don't know, timeline or schedule or PD around technology people where maybe the agency or some group can kind of give them some timelines to consider prior to testing. Make sure you're here, make sure you're there, and so that those pieces that often can be avoided, even not so much dealing with bandwidth and those issues. Sometimes it's just you have some people in the areas where technology may not have the staff that Dr. Martin has in his district, as he mentioned earlier, but you may have 1 to 2 people and they have not considered some things. So maybe the department could consider, by way of the IT area, giving some guidance to districts and their IT staff around being stop gates and stop points that said, hey, you need to have checked this, prior to that kind of thing. And that may actually, I don't know if that takes place or not. I see that Mr. John has had to leave, but I would have asked that because I believe as he was talking about some of the things that are fixable at the local level, but still we run into problems. I think the only recommendation I can offer would be maybe that the department could help to kind of spearhead and have some of those think tanks where you're meeting with these people prior to, so that certain things can be, kind of addressed, and also push out more information about the ability to get that support through the E-rate and some other things that he spoke of, that because they may not know that. Some of the districts just may not know that. So those are just my recommendations based on what I heard today. I see Dr. Vanderford.
Like a technical advisory manual.
Yep.
Yes, ma'am. I think that would be at least a right.
And we thank the department. I know that we got some, when it came out, Questar came out and said they had not updated to, the new iOS with Mac systems. We were like, well, wait a minute, you can't go backwards. And pressure was put from the state level, and they got that fixed, and we're moving forward, which is great. But knowing that, hearing that, 2 months or a month before testing is a lot different than the week of testing. And so making sure that you're going to have issues, you're going to have problems. Is when are they going to be identified? Can you identify them so that something can be done? And that takes the stress off. That takes some of the pressure off the testing window.
Question of doing that assessment that the department did 2 or 3 years ago of local districts' capabilities. maybe that could drive some of the PD for district staff.
Any other recommendations on technology? The last topic we have real quick, and there's not really much can be said there, is state testing. And Dr. Potter, I think we've talked about it before, but the only state mandated test that's not mandated from the federal government, to my understanding, is the third grade reading gate that was stated, and that's from the legislature, and then the U.S. history test and ACT. And I don't think anyone wants to do away with ACT for our juniors. I don't think the legislature or anybody wants to do away with third grade reading gate. So you come down to U.S. history, and the very people, I agree, the very people that would holler the most would be U.S. history teachers, and those, if you start taking away, I know in my district I have U.S. history being taught. If I don't have a U.S. history test, I'm going to have 4 or 5 U.S. history electives being taught, because everybody's going to be teaching. I love the Great Depression, and I love World War II, and that's where we're going to spend all our time. Or I love the Civil War, and that's where we're going to spend all our time. Whereas when I have U.S. history test that drives that, I know that I'm going to have U.S. history being taught by all 5 of my teachers.
Recommendation to discontinue U.S. history. Oh, Joyce, I know you want to make this recommendation.
I'm not saying a thing.
So wait a minute, you can't have it both ways. I mean, Kelly, this is your opportunity.
Regardless of what you do, there are going to be people who aren't happy for the reasons that we've stated.
I guess one question is: do we currently have world history electives and U.S. government electives being taught now?
I understand your Dr. Bazan. I do. I understand your question.
I know they're not elected.
Right. I understand your question, and again, that goes back to a district, a district mandate that makes sure that everybody's teaching the standards and how you do that. And so, but I do know when there's a state test to drive it, then there's not as much. There's no question in my mind. Whereas when I do have world history or economics or those things, the district, I have to make sure that that's being done on my part. But when I have a state test to do it, I know it's being done because I can look at the results.
But I don't understand why we can't do the same thing with U.S. history.
I can tell you the content in the world history courses when I was in the building was a lot richer because of the U.S. history exam and because of the U.S.'s place in the world and certain wars that happened and how that sort of thing. So I can tell you that a lot of the world history content was a lot richer due to the fact that there was a impending U.S. history exam. That's just my perception.
I surveyed our members, so I can't tell you, this percent. And I've heard mixed. I mean, I've heard just as many. We need to eliminate it because it's not required by the feds and it's just another test, as well as, well, why single U.S. history out? Why aren't we as good as English or math or,
This is the opportunity. The U.S. history test is really the test that gives us the greatest opportunity. If we want to make a recommendation to remove a test, that's the one to do. I think you're going to get mixed reaction across the board, whichever direction you go. What is the recommendation of the committee?
I would like to see that those who have a a larger connection with a bigger pool of teachers, because we've kind of expired with all of our opportunity. We didn't ask a direct question like that. You know, what do you think about the U.S. history test? You know, I don't believe anybody is oblivious to the fact that teachers do, in their perception, believe there's a lot of testing. I mean, that's clear. However, I'd like to see I mean, it doesn't have to be as formal as what we've done through this process, but just to get a litmus test of that just simply asks the question that we're asking right now. I mean, what do you think about the U.S. history test being eliminated specifically because that is the test that would not present an issue with ESSA, and it's the one that we could consider, and just get a little feedback from the practitioners and those with that. Well, yeah, specifically just at the high school, exactly. The ones who would be impacted by it, and just kind of get an idea.
As them is skewed. I would just say.
I think it'll get skewed. I'm thinking maybe more just high school in general, in my own personal opinion. Yes, ma'am. Yeah. I follow, but it'd be interesting to see what the results would be. But I could see us. I just like to see what that would be, because even in some districts with seniors that are in jeopardy, because the U.S. history teacher test is the junior year, and then you run into the senior year, and some of them have that. Those who haven't passed, I'm just mentioning that. Sometimes that's on people's mind because of where it is. And so I'd be interested just to get a feel of what people, and perhaps maybe the ones that are directly affected by it. Just as a quick, what do you think? This is on the table. Want your feedback. U.S. history folk and district level, maybe people perhaps.
Chairman Bennett, I'd be interested to hear, from in the halls of the legislature, talking with.
It's mixed. As a matter of fact, two of them that I talked to today, two legislators, actually this came up. It was on another issue, but it came up about the history of the social studies test. And the two that I was talking to today said that they would not vote to get rid of, to eliminate it. And but there's others out there who want it eliminated. There's no doubt about it. So it's kind of like the teachers. It's all over the board.
I think there's more. We need more information. I'm not ready for this committee to make a recommendation to do one or the other without more information.
I may be wrong on this, but with the social studies, that was mandated by legislation, wasn't it? Back before I was in the legislature, but I don't think that's MDE necessarily.
So the statute doesn't say what the assessment has to be.
Right.
It just outlines that there's 4 course assessments, 1 in each subject
Right.
area. So the state board determines what they say.
Okay. Well, thank you, Dr. Domleski. Thank you, committee members. Those of you that joined us by phone, I think this has been, real helpful. Let me ask you this. Is there a need, is there a want to come together a final time to do this, or do you think we can do this by email? The people who took down notes, send that to the department, and us let this be our final meeting as crickets chirp.
I'm sufficiently satisfied.
Then I would vote to let this be our final meeting. Thank you for serving in this capacity.
Fill up the chair.
I'm gonna raise